I'm going to start out by opening this up with my Patreon in the chat. For anybody interested in donating to that and becoming patrons, it starts at $1, goes all the way up to $100 a month, and you can donate obviously more than that. And any bit of money would be greatly appreciated. So I'm going to put that up right now. And we're going to go to the this topic. Now, as a preface to the topic, don't even try saying that I hate military members, because it's not even going to even come close to working. Because I have military members in my family, plus that have actually been throughout history. Plus, on top of that, when I actually earned both my bachelor's degree in history with a minor in business economics, plus my master's in public administration, there was actually not only military members with me for class, but also active military members, because it was done through distance learning because of my disability. And because of this, it was there was active military members that were serving actually at the time in Iraq, so and Afghanistan. They're actually in between classes doing homework. They're getting shot at. So anybody saying that basically that I don't actually care about military members is not exactly knowing what they're talking about here. What I'm talking about here is actually getting to the source of what we're doing with policy. This is what this discussion is actually about. Now we're going to be going into what this actual policy is. And I'm going to explain why what this topic is about. We're going to show that basically that all it's when it boils down to is when we start seeing these military contractors work with the government together, and they're making policy based off of how much money that they can make. It's basically it's when government comes together with business, and there's two ways you can essentially do this. You can essentially view it as crony capitalism, or you can view it as essentially as socialism. And being that the military isn't itself a social program, because of the way it's actually formed, because it's not actually acting in essentially a system in which we're dealing with business itself that's doing the actual thing, and it's actually a policy of actually paying for a social program. We need to view this as anything other than bare defense would be considered as socialism, as its actual formation. Now, considering this with it, we need to understand why would this be the case? And this is really the case with it. By looking, we can see that this is the case by looking at what really goes on. Now, if it were the case, you would see some certain things, such as since this change in policy to go from essentially a bare bones military, which would be previous to the idea of intervention, which would have actually existed, which our idea of intervention did not exist previous to the progressive era, and we did not see this. So what happened specifically during the progressive era, and that is actually identical to many of these regimes that are socialist. And what you'll see with it now, we won't go into the idea of military spending as well right now, but we will get to that. But what you're going to see is, if you go to the whole thing is, we were using essentially from this point, and even before this point, is you were seeing a lot of military propaganda. And we were doing it through posters at the start. Now, what happened later on after this point was this was from World War One. Now, World War Two was actually a different approach. World War Two actually had, we still continue this, but because film had become a building block, they had even done it through animated cartoons. You can actually watch old cartoons of Popeye, old cartoons of the Looney Tunes, such as with Bugs Bunny, and you will find a lot of propaganda for World War II. And this was a major change in the way that they did this, and this was actually being funded by the military. You'll find even throughout a lot of things with it, you'll actually find a lot of funding that goes out to these groups with it, and they what it was they actually changed the way the Constitution was viewed. They actually changed the term of advancing such things as arts and these other things like this, and they changed it from actually the basic standard to actually stating that they're going to actually deliberately fund these places, actually hand them money. And this purpose of the money was to essentially make propaganda. They would be basically, you get this money if you actually include these themes within your movie. And if you tend to look at some of the movies from from a lot of the eras throughout time, and you wonder why were there a lot of war movies during this era and that era? Why were they actually making this? Why specifically? And why did it come like right before these actual wars were built up? And if you've actually wondered that, there's a reason why. Because it's propaganda. They wanted to essentially build up the war effort, and that's the whole purpose of it. That's what propaganda's. That's what they do. Now, if you look at what you'll find from other socialist countries, from the Soviet Union to China to Nazi Germany to many other areas with it, you'll find the same activities. And when we look at even with spending, you'll find the idea of how they spend money is going to be very, very similar on military spending as well. Because when it comes down to the discretionary budget, you're going to find it to be very, very similar to what you get from other nations. And that's the whole point that you're going to find from what you find from a lot of these nations out there. Now, if we start to look at what we're seeing with the budget from 2020 budget, is we see when we look at the discretionary budget for the 2020 year, we see about the amount of about 1.426 trillion, and 750 billion of that comes from Department of Defense. You start to actually look at the pie chart of that, and you will basically see you will actually see when it comes down to an actual pie chart is you will see that basically more than half of the discretionary spending goes directly to the military. Now, this is actually an activity that is solely done by that would be done by nations that would be socialist or communist. This is basically how they react, and it doesn't matter what we see with it. And we look at the 2019 discretionary spending with it. We see 52% defense, 48% non-defense. And when we see our highest percentage of non-defense, it goes on to transportation at 7%. And that's kind of insane. And that's just 2019. And that kind of shows you that what we're doing. And we can see that when we start to go over the ideas of what the years are from from year to year, is you will start to see is that uh, you'll start to see that the percentage is a lot different. Yes, in the past we have been higher, but the fact is we did not have the expenditures on each thing that we had to output from these other departments. And this is essentially what we're talking about when we're looking at previous years. And back basically when it was in 1963, we were actually in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, so there was at least a legitimate reason. When we're talking about now is you're talking that there's no legitimate reason for a a war. I mean, basically, you're talking that there's a lot of money that gets wasted when it comes down to it, and this is what we see with the budget of the defense. And when we look at the defense, is the defense should not be something that ends up looking like that. That's not what we do. It's not the defense. It's military, and it's basically. And then when we start to look at our number of bases that we've gone over, it's over 800. This is during Obama's term. This is 800 bases in over 70 countries. We've actually stepped that number up because we've essentially we still expanded because of this is what Mattis wanted when Mattis was still there, and we need to understand that. And this is a big problem. And if we're going to look at this is why we declare this as an actual socialist system, because you're using this is militarism, not actually defense. And when we look at the title of the department, it's the Department of Defense. And when we start to look at uh, when we start to look at North Korea, you will start to see that a lot that their stuff is going to be very similar in the way they spend. And it's something that's a lot different than other countries. It's not different than the U.S. as a country. And when we're looking at their actual budget, is you're talking that they basically spend um, they basically spend about 10 billion when which is actually quite large for their portion of what they actually bring in economically. And we see that basically is that's we look at that is that's they're when we look at how countries like this spend is we look at some of the top ones is look at countries like China. China's another uh, socialist country or communist country, if you will, actually to many degrees. And we look at and we start to look at that, and you're going to see that they're basically in the same way. And it comes down to, and people are going to try to say, oh, but the percentage of the GDP. Well, the percentage of the GDP, that's based, GDP is not really an effective number because when it comes down to it is the GDP is based on an actual number of both government spending and business spending, which is not an and business and then the earnings within a country, so it's not an effective number to judge by. So when people try to use that argument's quite invalid. This is why when we look at, we should be looking at as the percentage of the budget. And when we start to see that we already know that it's over 50% of the discretionary budget. This means the things that basically are able to be regularly changed. And you can see from an actual thing of from the actual if you look at around from the actual military expenditures for countries uh, next to the rest of the world, you'll see that the United States just dominates the rest of the world in expenditures, which means it's completely insane. And we can see that the United States is by far the number one. We keep adding on more and more money. We're basically about 3 times that of the second place, which is China. And even with the additions of finances, we're talking that we're not going to adjust for it. I mean, we're basically percentage of GDP wise, with even we go with that, we're spending over 3% when China's only spending 1.9. So we should even if we're going to go with GDP as a factor, the world average is 2.2%. Just within that, that means if we were to spend the world average, which should mean that essentially you're out to protect yourself. This would be the world average. And this would mean that you're out. This would mean that you're the average country looking to protect yourself. This would lower it down about $205 billion, roughly, from what they stated back then, which would have been about, at that point, about six, and this is at 2017, spending at about $605 billion. Now we keep raising it up, and we can see this. When you keep seeing this, and we're working it up, and we're eventually going to be over We're eventually going to be over $1 trillion. You start to add up basically the other members of, if you add like, I believe it's the top 7 people, or the numbers 2 through 6 or 2 through 7, they about average what we spend in total military spending. And this is a problem. This should be a clear sign that we are not a capitalist nation. Because if we look at historically, this essentially is this would have been I mean, historically with it, I mean, the only time where we had a period where anything was close was where the Soviet Union was very high, and within that should give you an idea of what countries actually spend a great deal. Same thing we have right here, West Germany. There's another one. That's another country right up that alley. And uh, when we start to look at these numbers, we should have a real good idea. We start to go back to 1990, the U.S. and Soviet Union. 91, they fell, so it became Russia, and Russia did not have theirs listed at that time. So we became first, and France became second, and there was basically no one even close. 92, no one close. France second. 93, guess what? France is second. France actually at that time did a reduction as well as we did. 94, we did another reduction, and you had Russia that ranked a whopping 8th. 95, we did another reduction, and Russia ranked 10th. Japan then ranked second. And you start looking at this stuff with it. That's because even even China at that time, which did not have much wealth, because they weren't exactly developing enough industry at that point. So they were not very very productive. So when we look at this, you'll see that it wasn't until the 2000s that China was able to even make much of an impact. China wasn't able to really break the top 10 until we were talking about 1996. That was when they were first able to break the top 10 for military expenditures, and this shows where where they're at. And then when we're talking about this should tell you with it that we're spending horrible amounts of money. We go up to we're basically, even with the other people around us, we're spending insane amounts of money. Even the things with the height of our expenditures was 2011 with about over $711 billion. Now, where we actually spending other amounts of money is we're not really spending in any other discretionary area. I mean, if you start to look at the U.S. budget from 2011, which was our height, that would be our actual height of where our actual spending was. And that would basically include and that still would have made military budget, which would have a very, very similar numbers. I mean, it basically just drops the number of the top programs around it to about 6% instead of 7%. And that's roughly what we're talking about here. And that's where the whole problem was really coming down to. And it shows you that what we were doing, and that was basically the height of it. And if you look at basically is if we're going to go out to the, and that was at 52% when we start to go at like the 2020 budget, which is the most recent one, you're going to find out that that when it comes down to that budget is you're going to see that it's pretty much going to be about the same. It's going to be roughly roughly within about the same type of amounts. And this is where we're talking about why we describe this as actually a socialist program. Now, what would happen if we basically took the Trump's budget of 2020 if we took the 2020 budget and then we started actually applying down instead, we actually dropped it down to an actual true defense budget, which what you would actually see is you would be able to take that down to basically about $926 billion. Now that is basically quite a bit of savings from what you're talking about. This is actually when we talk about a free market defense department that's only about defense, because you're not worried about the other actual costs. Now this is all you're doing is you're actually just targeting Department of Defense. You're not actually getting rid of any of the other things, such as Department of Education. You're not cutting that out. You're not cutting out the Energy Department. You're not cutting out things like NASA that have no business existing. You're not dealing with the other agencies. You're not dealing with a lot of the waste from all these other things. You're not going through Health and Human Services and saying dealing with a lot of the waste there. You're basically going from point to point. And you would see very, very simply is that how this thing would actually work. And that's even without that point. And you could actually see that you're down to that point. Now you start to actually do something smart and actually eliminates the other 93.7 from education and energy, which have no business existing. And you're down to $832.3 billion for your discretionary spending. And when you start to take all of that out, you could definitely take all of that and put it toward buying out the actual loans that are that the U.S. government currently has, which is a great deal. Now, this is what we need to understand. Now, what would this do for the actual government? This means that what they can actually do is bring all of these military members home. Now, if you actually care about the military members, you would realize that this would actually bring all of them home. And it would allow them to actually exist within the United States and the United States territories and not be basically sent on these death missions and protecting other nations that don't matter one bit. Because you have to understand is what we're doing is when we talk about such things as is basically like such things as NATO is we're talking that we would is we wouldn't have to essentially lead to spending on NATO. Now, if we actually now what the big thing is getting the actual amount broken down by not just percentage, but actually the actual amount that's actually spent. Now, people try to break it down to GDP expenditures, which is completely useless. And basically, if we look at the amount wasted on the NATO, we would have to let me see the yeah, if we start to look at actually percentage wise with it, we're basically on the hook for quite a bit of money of the actual spending. Yeah, so when it comes down overall with it, is with the whole budget is their whole budget is quite large with it compared with it, so we're actually dumping a lot of money. And basically is since we pay quite a bit of the contributions, about basically roughly about a fifth of it, a little over a fifth, we pay quite a bit. Plus, there's actual other exercises that we're actually paying for beyond that as well, and there's a lot of money that goes into other forms of it. and basically other commitments that they want for our Department of Defense within that actually start to add up. And that this is where we start to get problems. Even though we know that it doesn't reciprocate. And this is why we start to say that our defense, our actual military is actually socialist. And that this is why we start to make this argument. And when we start to see that we start to act as a global military and not act as a actual form of defense. I mean, when we actually title Department of Defense, it should act as a defense, and it should act as a defense solely for its own country. And when you see that it's basically acting as essentially a system for other countries, other nations, acting for the ideas of intervention, you'll see that basically, while it might not be as a socialist within its own country, it's acting on the actual nature of what a normal socialist program would. And this is the way a socialist military would react. And a socialist military would react in a very, very imperialistic manner, because it needs this to essentially function. But in this case, instead of actually functioning for the will of the state, it's actually functioning for the will of special interests, which don't always include the United States. And it's basically its will of the interest is basically the will of the state, the will of the contractors, as well as the will of other national lobbyists, and will of the foreign NGOs. And this is what we're finding here, and that's essentially what's making it act in a very, very similar manner to what a socialist government would do. And if we're actually a free market system, we would not see these contracts happen. And these contracts are essentially distorting the actual way in which a normal thing would function. Such as, let's say, Raytheon. Raytheon makes the actual missile targeting systems. Now, Raytheon goes, hey, you haven't had a war in a while. Our stocks are going down because of this. We need war, because if you don't have war, we actually lose money. So what they do, they start barking at the different. They'll start barking at the Defense Department. Come on, let's hurry this up. We need war, and this is where we start getting these things. And they'll start doing this. They'll start influencing it. Now, this is where we start to get these different things. Now, other countries and other NGOs go, hey, we don't like this one country. We need you to invade. Now, you're not actually acting on the will of the actual people for defense. You're actually acting completely against that. Now, this is something you've actually completely abandoned. Now, where's all your money coming from? Well, your money's actually coming from loans that you've actually put in the name of the people of your country. That's one of the ways with it. You've actually also taken massive taxation. And since you are a social program to begin with, in which there's actually a basic social contract, but that social contract is for, as we've described, defense. They've never stated that there's a social contract for being the world's policeman, for being beholden to other foreign nations, for being beholden to defense contractors. Nothing else. It's only for the defense of the nation and its territories, and nothing more. Anything beyond that is essentially acting against the will of the nation. Now, this is that's why we get back to the socialist idea, because essentially you've essentially created this mix of government and business. Now, this only happens in two areas. It happens in crony capitalism and it happens in socialism. Now, we know it's not crony capitalism because they would essentially be able to freely interact and sell to other people, and they're going to be using the government as a way to promote their products and to eliminate the competition. We know this is not the case. This is why we cannot declare that as crony capitalism. We see that with such things as what companies like Microsoft have done in the past, trying to use that to enforce a lot of laws in the past to eliminate the competition. Now, Microsoft has actually gotten busted before in the past for using a lot of this crony capitalism, um, and uh, and a lot of companies, some companies do get busted, some companies don't. When using crony capitalism, trying to basically get in bed with government. Now, in the way we see Amazon doing it in one aspect with it, but they're also in the aspect of being a defense contractor, so they're kind of a little bit of both. But when you talk about the defense side with it, they don't actually you don't have the ability from an these contractors don't have the ability to sell these materials to other companies. Just like when we're talking about when we talk about these different things, you as a regular citizen cannot go out and buy a missile launcher or any missile launching materials. You can't. That's restricted by the government. They what they do is they buy exclusive rights to these things and declare when these companies can sell to other nations and for what nations they can sell to, because they view it as a security risk. And what they'll do is they do this, and this is their version of cronyism, but it goes under socialism though, because what they do is they'll make the they'll make the consumer pay for all of their R&D, all of these things, and it's basically working between the two. Now, the only place in which this actually happens is in socialist countries. Free market capitalist countries don't do this. And when it comes down to it, we're talking that this is something that occurs. You don't basically order around and basically essentially take control of corporations. That's something that actually happens only in socialist and communist countries. And that's essentially what we're seeing here. And that's basically what they're doing. They're claiming it as national security. And that's why we call that's why we call the U.S. military a socialist system. Because if they were actually just buying the products one by one and letting them sell to whoever they do with it, if some consumer down the street wanted to buy an F-18, they'd be free to do it, but they basically, let's just say, would not have any weapons loaded on it, obviously, but they would be free to buy an F-18. What the military goes is no, 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 or like an F-35 or something. The military goes no, 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 we can't allow that. We cannot allow people to buy these military jets. This cannot be allowed. We have to have exclusive rights to these, and then we have to decide who can buy it and who cannot. And this is where we get the socialist part. And what we've been doing this for a long time. And this is what happens. And what the outcome is you get a government that gets a bloated military. And the contractors, because they have this tie to the military, they go, we want more war, and we want more intervention, and we want all of these things. Guess what? They basically every time the government says let's bomb brown people, their stockholders make a lot of money, and that's how they're arranged. Now, for a free market system, the government would say, okay, we've been attacked. We need military jets. Or we're looking as we might be attacked. Okay, we need some military jets. Okay, we're gonna buy from you, and we need, let's say, 8 F-18s. Okay, we need you to deliver them to this spot immediately. And that contractor would do it. And that contract, or that company would do it, and they deliver it. And then they would not be restricted in who they would sell to. They could basically sell to any person, and then the government could also, if they need it fast, they could also work in a deal with someone who independently purchased them, and they could put restrictions on on people from buying, let's say, missiles or something if they wanted to do that, and allow these individual companies to only sell to countries, and say it has to be, and put restrictions, they must sell to an actual country itself, and tell them they're not restricted from whatever country they can sell to because it's free market capitalism, but they must sell to a country. They cannot sell to individuals or any individual groups, regardless of what the situation is. And that would be the actual difference. And what the outcome would be is, as we would see, is you would see a budget that would be a fraction of the size, and we wouldn't have the debt that's, basically, we're talking it's so large it's not even funny. I mean, we're currently at 22.1 trillion and counting. When we're talking about the tax revenue is not enough to cover anything. And if you want to know basically the debt per taxpayer, you're going to love this one. It's about $180,599 currently. The debt per citizen is $67,333. Just so you know, this is that's actually more than the actual per capita income. That's more than the average. That's more than Mr. Average makes. That should be a little bit of a clue how much basically we're actually in the hole as a government. Now, people try to say, oh, we owe the money to ourselves. Actually, we do not. We do not owe the money to ourselves. We actually owe the money to the actual debt holders. These are people who actually invest bonds into these loans. And basically, these loans need to be paid back, just like any other thing. And this is why we don't owe it to ourselves. We actually owe it to these people who have investment into these bonds, and these bonds need to be paid back. And there's several different ownership groups, including some people in retirement, such as federal workers. Now, there are a lot of federal workers who have investment into these that they lock in because they are federal workers. There's a lot of overseas owners as well, including China and Russia. And when we keep adding this up, and this keeps going up basically at an alarming rate, I mean, it's so fast with it, basically, you blink and there's basically another pretty much $20,000-$30,000 added. You essentially turn your head and there's another $100,000 added, and that should give you an idea of what's going on. And this is what's happening, and it's not going down, it's going up. When people say, oh, Trump is cutting the budget, and he's going to cut the budget and he's going to save money, no, there's no actual money that's coming in. And if they try to say, oh, but we'll use money from tariffs, well, the tariffs aren't going to cut it. This is basic. The tariffs aren't cutting it. It doesn't matter what tariffs they do. And guess what? When it comes down to the corporate tax, which is a lot of it, corporate tax and the payroll tax and income tax, which is a lot of it, actually the bulk of it uh, is through a lot of those things, and we're talking that there's not much you can essentially get. And these things, you're basically, we're talking that when we're in such a hole, this is just what happens, and you end up being in such a hole that this is just the occurrence. And when you have over $180,000 per taxpayer of debt, nobody can afford it. And we have people saying, "Oh, we can just add more money. Oh, just add more money. That's the solution." And this is why we talk about the actual idea of this military being a socialist program, because it's not about actual legitimate forms of. It's not about a legitimate actual idea for defense. If it were, I would be fully behind it, because it would be at least a legitimate social program, and we could at least get behind it. But this isn't. It's actually become something that is mimicking what the Soviet Union did, mimicking what China's doing, and mimicking what all these other countries are doing. We could get down easily to $250 billion and just guard our own nation and tell everyone you're on your own. Because, I mean, we don't need NATO anymore, because even the EU has actually discussed the idea of having a European military. This means that even they have even thought about the same idea, that they feel that it's insane to actually have NATO, and that it's not actually functional to have NATO, and it doesn't work for them, because there's a huge disconnect in cultures between Europe and the United States. We're not the same thing. And when we have ideas from George Washington who say we should not get into their affairs, I mean, it should be clear and obvious that NATO should never have been even thought of. We should have basically been on our own when it came down to dealing with the Soviet Union. We should never have even thought of basically working with other nations. We should have only been thought of basically, how is the Soviet Union going to impact us? Don't care about other nations, just care about ourselves. Those other nations are free to deal with their own problems. This is why we have this thing called sovereignty. And because all you're going to do is grow your actual, make more militarism, and that's socialist. And we don't need that. We don't need that. We don't need any of the propaganda that comes with it. And we don't need any of this other garbage, because we're so far in debt, we can't afford anything. We have an infrastructure which is basically crumbling. I mean, you look at our infrastructure, it's crumbling. You look at basically everything about our nation, and it's going to hell. And we have people saying, no, we have to spend basically half our discretionary budget on military. No, we can actually spend a basically no more than about what's that? We could easily get away with about 17% of the actual discretionary budget, if not probably it might be actually higher. But basically, we're talking that's because of the reduction in the actual amount. But we're probably within the 20s for percentage wise, because we'd be actually reducing the budget itself. So probably the 20s or 30s, but we would actually be reducing the actual budget itself, and that's what we need to actually do. I mean, we have stuff that's basically, we're so far in debt right now. I mean, we're talking the ideas what we're spending on defense and the amount was being spent on defense and war. You see those numbers climbing at such an amount. The amount of interest paid, you can see that just climbing. Basically, currently we've already spent almost, and I believe this is done per year to date, and that's basically over $9,000, $9,413. Total debt per citizen over $222,000. That's for U.S. debt, and that's because we have other liabilities that are actually held. So when we're talking about this is what we have out there because of the actual debt that actually we have. There's other unpaid liabilities that are not being considered. And when we start looking at this is not what we need. We don't need a socialist military, and that's what needs to be understood. And people need to really call it out for what it is. And this is basically, if we actually care about our people in the military, we'd actually understand this and understand we actually need a free market defense department, not a socialist military. Because we're copying exactly what brought down the Soviet Union, and if we want to basically fall like the Soviet Union did, basically we're doing exactly what they did. And that's exactly kind of what happened. Is we're copying exactly what they did, and that's why they completely fell apart. People go, oh, but it's because the idea of socialism failed. No, it's because they spent so much on militarism that they couldn't handle it anymore, and their actual dollar, or I should say their currency, their actual currency actually failed. The Soviet ruble actually failed, and that's what happened because it was a fiat currency, and the central bank couldn't bail them out. It kind of reminds you of the same thing that we're going through. The central bank with it can keep working as hard as they do with it, but eventually you kind of reach the end of the road. And guess what? We've reached the end of the road, and that's what we have right here. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure that you and that's about it with it. Sorry, I was checking something else out. But sorry, that's